I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The most important words of my life.
I'm here tonight.
I stand
before you today
to declare that I am a candidate
for President of the United States.
I am running
for President of the United States.
I officially announce my candidacy
for President of the United States.
I'm running for president.
I am officially running
for President of the United States.
From the University of Virginia Center for Politics, this is Sabato's Crystal Ball, America Votes.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Center for Politics and the 22nd Annual American Democracy Conference. It frightened me when I first saw that. I've been to all 22. I'm just getting older, but the American Democracy Conference is getting better and shorter because of the pandemic. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank my Crystal Ball team for their phenomenal work in forecasting the 2020 election. We got 49 out of 50 states correct, as well as the District of Columbia and both the Maine and Nebraska Electoral College votes. Thank you to Kyle and Miles Coleman, as well as our Crystal Ball interns, Keenan Mayer, Thomas Awad, Tanmay Gupta, and Chris Obolinski, who was not a formal intern and is not getting any academic credit, but who has been mentioned more than any student in UVA history for having done what he's been doing. So he's gotten plenty out of this. Chris, no complaints, please. All right, we have a great lineup of panelists for you today. Our moderator is, of course, Kyle Condit, managing editor of the Crystal Ball. He's an expert on American politics who has appeared on CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, PBS NewsHour, and Comedy Central's The Daily Show. You didn't tell me about that one. I'd like to see that.
It was a while back, but I can always put it on my bio.
Absolutely.
Take it away
forever. No, it's in the obituary too. Put it down for your obituary.
Right.
All right. His excellent book, and it really is great, on Ohio's presidential voting history, The Bellwether, was released in June 2016. I recommend it to everybody. He also serves as the center's communications director and is based in Washington, where he manages the center's DC office, which is actually part of his apartment, so that we don't pay his rent. And it's now being shared with his and his wife Lottie's new baby, Albie, born right before the election. Now, you think you had it busy during the election? Think about what Kyle was going through with the new baby and with covering this incredible election. So I congratulate you on all that, Kyle, and we're very proud of you. Now, let's get to our panelists. We want to start with Jamelle Bouie, heralded as one of the defining commentators on politics and race in the Trump era. And goodness knows you had enough to write about. Jamelle Bouie, of course, is a University of Virginia graduate. He is an opinion columnist for the New York Times and political analyst for CBS News. Jamelle has previously served as chief political correspondent for Slate. In 2013, he contributed to the center's book, Barack Obama and the New America. It seems like a century ago, doesn't it? This is his second stint as a Center for Politics resident scholar, and we're very pleased to have him in that job. Next, John Lapp. John Lapp is a partner at Ralston Lapp Media. For the DSCC, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, Senate Majority PAC, and the League of Conservation Voters, among others, many others, John has led major advertising campaigns that help to elect all kinds of Democrats. Just to mention the senators, I think he's pretty much automatically confirmed for anything he applies for. He's elected Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, Tammy Baldwin, Joe Donnelly, Martin Heinrich, Tim Kaine, Elizabeth Warren, John Tester, Jeanne Shaheen, and I'm stopping there. I mean, it's just, there are too many to go through. I have to say, you're getting the impression that all these people are connected to UVA. Of course they are. People of substance almost always are. And John was my student back in the 1990s, and he was a star student. I knew he was going places. We used to have a lot of conversations about what was happening in politics, and he knew more than I did. All right. Tara Setmeyer, last but not least, Tara Setmeyer. She is currently a CNN political commentator and senior advisor for the Lincoln Project. Boy, I want you to write a book about that. With a signature tell it like it is style. And she does have that with the Thanksgiving background there, which will change to Christmas, she told me right after Thanksgiving. She brings a fresh perspective to breaking down the news of the day. After the 2016 election, Vulture.com, who named her one of that cycle's top 20 election coverage stars. Her commentary can also be found on her podcast, Honestly Speaking with Tara, where she aims to be a conservative voice of reason. She stresses themes like civility in politics, something that the Center for Politics has at the core of its mission. And the mission is becoming more difficult with each passing day. Before becoming a recurring figure in national media, Tara is a resident scholar at the Center for Politics this academic year. So we're happy to have you as well. Now, we're missing one panelist. He canceled on us last night. He's an old friend of mine, but that doesn't excuse him. Chris LaCivita is a partner at FP1 Strategies. He's a former Marine. He's also the recipient of the Purple Heart. Political director of the National Republican Congressional Committee for 2 cycles. That's really asking for punishment. And I think most important of all, he is the father of Victoria LaCivita. And if I'd had enough time, I would have found Victoria and put her on this panel, and she would have done a better job than Chris. And I want you to know that, Chris. That's your penalty for missing any future panels. And that is that. And I'm looking forward to hearing this group. And Kyle Condick, managing editor of the Crystal Ball, new father, take it away.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I've kind of an open-ended question that I want to start with that I want to ask all 3 panelists, and I'll pose it first to Jamel, and kind of just giving you a blank canvas. What either did or did not surprise you about the results that we saw in this election?
It's a difficult question in part because I think this was a much stranger election than I think people anticipated going into it. I think the expectations that things would be pretty straightforward based off of the polling and based off of kind of where it looked like things were going in those weeks going into it. But, we can look back and see, the thing that we expected to happened, massive turnout across all demographics in every state. And the thing that we didn't expect to happen, how that massive turnout would play out, is sort of what's interesting about it, that the huge unprecedented turnout simply scrambles our expectations for how elections play out. And so you have this somewhat unusual top line result, the president losing, his party actually making gains down ballot. You have this other unusual result, or seemingly unusual result, which is that the Democratic Party made up some of its losses with non-college whites, and then the Republican Party made up some of its losses with African Americans and Hispanics over the last cycle, which is, I don't think it's something anyone really expected. We have these 2 flips, Arizona and Georgia, which on one hand aren't that surprising, right? The flips are built on Democratic gains with college-educated whites and big turnout amongst some groups of non-whites. But also, it is kind of shocking that Georgia and not North Carolina were the states that flipped, that Arizona, a state that has not gone Democratic in, 70 years, 72 years, has flipped. And although it's narrow, Democrats look like they'll be able to continue making gains there going into the future. So this isn't so much a direct answer as to say, like I started, this was a strange election. And I think part of why you see, Democrats collapsing into infighting over it, despite winning the presidency, is precisely because some of these outcomes just cut so across expectations that folks are having a hard time kind of figuring out what it all means.
John, same question to you. Yeah. What did not surprise you? And of course, if you want to, reply to anything that Jamel said.
Yeah, no, I think, I think that was great. I'll leave that at the presidential level. I'll talk a little bit about that. I guess what was surprising to me is how short President-elect Biden's coattails were. I mean, among the very, very shortest, that there were places where to actually win, we had to not just hang in with Biden, we had to outperform at the congressional level, at the Senate level. And I guess, look, presidential election years are so much a reflection of parliamentary elections that you can run these races and back and forth in all those ways. But it really, if you look at the only places really where they broke partisanship, it was like Maine at both the congressional and the Senate level. Otherwise, it broke all the ways. Obviously, I worked in a bunch of Senate races and a bunch of House races. So one, I guess the irrational exuberance, as you say, with how much we thought we were going to be roll tide roll and really run the table on this stuff. And two, I think part of the shock is, look, let's face it, Donald Trump's entire presidency was filled with hate and divisiveness. And I think there's just a part of it that where Democrats felt this is an illegitimate president. They'll clearly have seen what has happened, how he's mishandled the economy, how he's torn us apart. It's going to be overwhelming at every level, this repudiation. And it really wasn't. So that's number one, I think, is that shockwave of the irrational exuberance that every poll. Two, how off, and we'll talk a lot more about this, polling was. We had polls Thursday before the election day, and I don't know why those were done, but they were done, where we were up in congressional races by 52%. We were up in states winning these Senate races. And so we weren't just 2 points off or 4 points off as Democrats, but we were off by 8. We were off by 10. And the other surprising thing is Republicans, clearly in talking with them, had the same wrong polling that also reflected the public polling. So it makes it very hard to make strategic decisions, both on content, on targeting and allocation of resources, when your polling is so very, very off. But I think most of all, what is surprising is just how much the polling within the discrepancy from the voting. And I think there has to be a reckoning within our party as to how we can fix this, if it's fixable, and if not, what are the other things we can bring into this so that we're not so dependent on this. What I worry about is after every election, you sort of take folks, you whip them, you lash them, you draw and quarter them, and then you go back to business as usual. And based on this election, what happened, we cannot go back to business as usual. And happy to talk more about some of the messaging things and the separation, both on the issues of the presidential and on the down ballot, but there was a big separation between those two, clearly.
Tara, again, feel free to reply to anything you've heard so far, but also, surprises or things that didn't surprise you in the election.
Yeah, so one of the biggest surprises for me was the fact that 71 million people voted for a sociopath.
Right.
I was quite dismayed at the fact that Donald Trump expanded his voters' voting numbers. I was shocked that white women voted for him in larger numbers this time around than last time. I was very dismayed by that. I was also very surprised at the number of Hispanic voters that voted for Donald Trump this time in places along the border in Texas. Not as surprised about South Florida, given the impact of the Cuban population there and their ideas around socialism and what was happening in Venezuela. I mean, Marco Rubio and those guys had a lot of influence talking about that. And in South Florida, it's a unique area. But I was very surprised at women. And even though I'm a little skeptical of the exit polling, I'll be curious to see when it's all drilled down after we kind of get out of this situation we're in now with the disputes over the election and this and that, to see where suburban women actually had an impact. We thought, and based off the polling, that suburban women would be the ones that made the difference here. And I'm not quite sure that was the case. Perhaps in areas, in Arizona, Maricopa County, and no offense, Kyle, but I think Arizona's the new bellwether now, not Ohio anymore. But that maybe you can write another book.
Yeah.
I'm happy to see what happened in Arizona, but I think that was also a unique situation given the attacks on native son John McCain, by Donald Trump, which I think a lot of folks may have found unpalatable. Cindy McCain coming out and endorsing Joe Biden and campaigning on behalf of Joe Biden may have moved that needle. Obviously, our work in the Lincoln Project, we focused a lot in Arizona, both with the Latino vote and with those Republicans that just couldn't take Donald Trump anymore. And our after action report is showing that some gains were made there. But the biggest surprise for me, and also to be frank, the fact that it looks as though it's the Black vote that was so suppressed in 2016 and depressed in 2016 may have been what put this whole thing over the top. When you look at the numbers in Michigan and Detroit, you're looking at over 100,000 more people voting in Detroit alone that as of right now. I mean, Joe Biden's up by 148,000 votes there. Trump won it by 11,000 votes last time. So that's an incredible increase in voter turnout, which I'm glad to see. Same thing in Georgia. Lincoln Project also, we put efforts in get out the vote efforts in the Atlanta suburbs. And the amazing work of Stacey Abrams and folks that saw the changing demographics in Georgia as an opportunity to turn Georgia blue. And as a longtime Republican, the idea that Georgia and Newt Gingrich's districts and those places would go blue, it was pretty extraordinary. But the demographics were catching up with them. And it's looking at all of those things, and also the fact that the Republicans gained seats. I just could not believe, given everything that's gone on, given the state that the country is in with the pandemic and Trump's failures, that the Republicans actually gained seats and that they gained female Republican seats at the greatest numbers. That is a shock to me and again, dismaying, which is why I made the decision on the day after the election, when I saw how many people voted for Trump and that Trumpism was not repudiated, that I would walk away from my 27 years of being a part of the Republican Party. Still a small C conservative, but I will have nothing to do with a party that has fully taken on the malignancy of Trumpism.
Sort of a good transition to the next question for Jamel. Jamel, you wrote a column a couple of days after the election in which you basically said that Democrats, ever since Trump got elected, were waiting for this sort of massive repudiation of Trump, and it just never happened.
That's right. This gets to the kind of the split results of Tuesday, right? That Donald Trump loses the presidential election. Republicans make these down ballot gains. Democrats are holding on to the House, but it's sort of a slim hold. We're waiting on the Georgia specials in January to see how the Senate goes. But even then, the odds of a Republican Senate are pretty high. And so the big repudiation that I think Democrats and liberals were hoping for just isn't going to happen. I think the fact that Donald Trump gain more votes is significant. It's maybe not as significant as some have made it out to be, since his overall vote share is probably not going to be too different from where it was in 2016. So he's sort of big turnout. He gained enough votes from big turnout that he didn't lose anything, but not so much. He didn't sort of like build that much on his existing coalition, but even still, he won way more votes than he did in 2016. In the column, I argued that the things about Trumpism which seem to have a real political constituency are the what I called kind of ethnic chauvinism part of it, the attacks on low-income housing in the suburbs, the attacks on Black Lives Matter, the anti-immigration rhetoric from 2016. That does seem to have a real constituency. I think this is this other thing that I think is very underrated about Trump's appeal. His sort of celebrity. I mean, he was a celebrity game show host, and that celebrity game show hostness is still part of his political persona. And this sense in which Trump is inviting viewers to join him in this kind of performance of prosperity, I think is actually very appealing to people. It makes a lot of people feel like they are at the center stage of a show. And I think that is a powerful thing Trump has. And then I think his kind of this aggrieved and very aggressive performance of masculinity, the sort of tough guy persona, where all the palace intrigue reporting about the Trump administration shows very clearly that he's not actually very much of a tough guy, but he projects this image of toughness that I think is appealing. When you bundle all those things together, I think they are a viable message, a viable pitch to specifically low engagement, low information voters who are attracted to it. And I don't know if this is replicable. Like I can't imagine the traditional Republican politician who can do all of this. Like the celebrity stuff in particular is sort of going to be, if there's going to be another Trump-like figure, it's going to be another celebrity. I don't think Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley can replicate that. But different elements of it can be taken apart and used for future appeals. And that's what I think we're going to see going forward, that it's probably possible to build a genuine majority out of kind of the foundation Trump has laid. And I don't think Republicans are going to give up the attempt to do so going forward.
John, in the aftermath of the election, there's been some sniping between some of the progressives in the Democratic House caucus, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and some of the kind of less liberal, more moderate members like Connor Lamb from Pennsylvania and Abigail Spanberger from Virginia. Sure. A lot of the swing district members are concerned that some of the Republican messaging on attacking Democrats over defunding the police and energy issues and other things, that some of those things drew blood. Do you think that was the case?
I do. I just want to completely agree with what was said about in addition to Trumpism, the Trump celebrity was such a big part of that, which I also think allowed for the slicing off of Latino voters and African-American voters, that there was this permission and acceptance beyond the ideology that allowed and gave permission, that made him sort of this exciting television, like direct TV kind of salesman beyond and separate from Trumpism. So I think on the silver lining, I think besides the Trumpism, the hate there's a Trump part that I do think will be hard to replicate. To answer your question about the problem down ballot, I think one of the things what's interesting is when you really take a step back and look at this, the presidential race was very set in terms of Biden's message, the collective, the fight for the soul of America. It was very much Trump versus Biden. This is that choice. And then there really wasn't room or oxygen. In a way, it was a national battle between two people and two visions. But separate from that, what became, and by the way, it is just still shocking if you look at how close that was, that it was not a repudiation. I think anybody who says this is a repudiation of Trump and Trumpism, it is not. It is very much a divided country and will remain so incredibly hard to govern. I think down ballot, though, what was really tough, I do think the default messaging for Democrats became defund the police and socialism. So the amount of, for instance, police officers and law enforcement personnel that I had to put in ads to basically say, no, we believe you have a right to defend your communities and be safe and stay safe and want to fund the police. Of course, there is a systemic problem and discrimination within our system, but that became the default, which is a real problem. To me, that's where it was. The other part of it is, if you think about it, COVID and coronavirus became not just the mask part, that became a partisan issue. And there was I think one part of, if you look at where people were answering the phones, both cell and hardline, I bet there were much more Democrats and independent leaning Democrats staying at home, working from home with that ability, answering those polls and skewing that way, which made it hard to wait. But also the folks who are just like, look, I don't have the luxury to stay home and quarantine. I have to go to work. And it became do you want to open up the economy or do you want to stay at home, on top of the tearing apart the country with the socialism and the defund the police. And I do think it's a real problem. And there is a real reckoning there. Look, there was a lot of great base mobilization. It is incredible, as was mentioned, what happened in Michigan, but it doesn't have to be an either or. Part of what we have to do is continue to mobilize the base, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. We have to have a more compelling message of persuasion. If you look at an Abigail Spanberger, you can have a person who is still plenty progressive, but also a moderate with a military type background who can win. But we have to embrace both things. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But if you look at the majorities that we've had, you build it and grow it with a bigger tent, not a smaller one.
Tara, feel free to respond to anything you've just heard if you'd like. But also, you mentioned that you've left the Republican Party. And also that, it seems like some other folks were, disenchanted with Trump, obviously not the party. But I'm thinking of Republicans who, remain Republicans, and obviously there's still a lot of those folks out there. Do you think that they will look back on the Trump era with regret, or will they look at it and say, hey, we actually had 2 decent elections in 16 and 20, got some Supreme Court seats, got some legislation done? I mean, I think that in some ways, maybe, and Jamel was talking about this a little bit, that part of a repudiation of Trump would be the Republicans saying, hey, we made a mistake nominating Trump. And I guess I don't know if a lot of Republicans will look at it that way.
Yeah, I'll answer that part first, and then I have a couple things to say about what was just talked about. But I think that they will rationalize this. There will be a rationalization for the fact that they made the decision to completely sell out their Republican principles, that they went along with someone who was as dishonest and irreverent and indecent as Donald Trump, who allowed hundreds of thousands of Americans to get sick and die because he didn't care. And he thought that it was more politically expedient for him to pit Americans against each other, to make politically weaponized mask wearing during a mass pandemic. All of those things, they will rationalize it away for the exact reasons that you just listed. If you look on paper, they gained political power. Yes, they may have lost the White House, but they gained an unprecedented number of lifelong judicial appointments. They got a tax cut through that Republicans have wanted for a very long time. They've increased they maintained the Senate, it looks like. I think that it's more likely that they will keep the Senate. We'll see. But so on paper, they can go, well, we had to put up with that for 4 years, but we survived and we came out being able to say we expanded the tent, which is incredibly ironic, given, to Jamel's point, given the amount of ethnocentric white grievance, nationalist populism, just the darkness of Donald Trump and the ugly racial animus that he stirred up to mainstream it, starting with Charlottesville, ironically. Well, actually starting before that, but during his presidency with his reaction to Charlottesville, one of the most defining moments of his presidency early on, and it set the tone from that point forward. So I just think that Republicans, when you're looking at it from a purely political power, partisan perspective, they haven't learned their lesson. The only way that elected officials or a party learns its lesson is if it's repudiated, which did not happen, which was to my disappointment. I held on, hoping that repudiation would happen and that there would be an opportunity for folks like myself, and there are a lot of us out here that are now politically homeless as conservative independents, but that there would be an opportunity, an opening for those of us to come in and kind of build it back up again after it had been burned to the ground. Well, that clearly it became very clear to me after the election that there was no room for that anymore, which is why I made the decision to walk away from it and try to set an example from outside the party, and we'll see what happens moving forward. We'll figure it out. But as far as the Trumpism side of this, the not only was I alarmed by how the cult of personality was so strong, and that people were able to, that they were willing to cast everything aside for this con artist celebrity because he had been beamed into their homes, pretending to be this successful businessman and in command of things during The Apprentice. It was all a facade. There's nothing real about reality shows, but the power of creating those images and the power of that being beamed into people's homes for 14 years, it was extraordinary to see that. And I think there'll be volumes written about the influence of reality television and creating those images and the marketing of a candidate. Right. And someone like Donald Trump, who's so obviously, it's crazy because there's so many things that are out there that can show you, that disprove that he's a successful businessman or that he's this tough guy, but it doesn't matter. It's fascinating. And what concerned me is that how many people were willing to go along with his very illiberal approach to governing, and how many Republicans who were supposed to be the oversight capacity, the guardrails, were willing to get rid of that for pure political power and political gains. The creeping in of the authoritarianism type of behavior by Donald Trump, not only with his cozying up to dictators, and the press is the enemy of the people, and a lot of the things that he was doing, that circumventing Congress, but just his reaction to the election. And this is not what we do in this country. This is what we've done, and this is what we fight against in other countries that are less democratic than ours, and people are accepting this, rationalizing it. That's a problem, because that concerns me about where this country goes and what they'll accept moving forward. Just from a pure democratic situation, are the health of our democracy moving forward, whether that celebrity and that attraction to a cult of personality outweighs our constitutional republic and its foundations. That alarms me. And then the idea of the Democrats and their messaging, I could not agree more that the defund the police and this idea of socialism was terrible. I've been a political communications person for the entirety of my adult life. That's been my focus. And I was horrified by that, and was going, no, Democrats, stop this. What are you doing? And I felt that that Biden was not tough enough. He was not aggressive enough in combating that, and allowed Donald Trump and his people, with the power of right-wing media, to define that, to set that narrative. So he was constantly on defense. And I come from a law enforcement family, and I'm very connected to a lot of law enforcement folks and organizations. And there was no convincing them, unfortunately, at that point, that Democrats weren't about defunding police, and that this was an anti-police thing. And I think that had an influence in, with suburban women as well, the idea of safety. And that's why they did it. It's the law and order playbook of Nixon. So to my Democratic friends out there, you guys got to get that together, because that messaging is terrible. Between that, and I watched a lot of ads around the country in different swing states, and the focus was the defund the police issue, and that Joe Biden's going to raise your taxes, and then we're going to have socialism, over and over and over again, with people in these areas. And, if you don't want to think about Donald Trump, because it's uncomfortable to face the fact that Donald Trump's a bigot and a racist and incompetent, because, people don't want to face that fact because they supported him, but they do understand their pockets. They do understand their communities and feeling safe. And it was successful, I think. And that's probably what contributed to down ballot races going more toward Republicans.
Can I push back a little bit? Just like a gentle pushback here. So looking at sort of the totality of down ballot races, there were no Democrats, even left-wing Democrats, running on defund the police or running on socialism. That the extent to which that was associated with Democrats, I think you're right, Tara, reflects Republican messaging and reflects like the power of the party's affiliated media. I think in this conversation, though, we should also look to what may have been a failure of congressional Democratic leadership strategy. So starting at the top of 2019, congressional leaders argued that the way to preserving the Democratic majority and growing the Democratic majority was a singular focus on healthcare. They were going to run on protecting pre-existing conditions. They were going to run on protecting the Affordable Care Act. And the message to vulnerable members, to frontline members, was to focus on healthcare to the exclusion of all things. And that's what they did. I live right by Spanberger's district. It's just, a 30 or 40 minute drive out the way. And we're more or less in the same media market. And so I can kind of like pay attention up close to the kind of messaging from that campaign. And although she did win, the messaging was entirely focused on healthcare. And I think the problem that congressional Democrats faced was that a singular message, although healthcare always tops the list of concerns for Democrats or concerns for the public, the singular kind of, I think, monomaniacal focus on healthcare left the campaigns actually kind of brittle and left them vulnerable to the kinds of attacks Republicans were going to make. The fact of the matter is that there is no situation in which I think the Republican messaging machine is not going to attack Democrats as socialists, is not going to attack Democrats as anti-police. The law and order playbook has existed for 40 years. It's just sort of part of the landscape now. And I think it's incumbent on Democrats to build campaign messaging strategies that can internalize the fact that they're never going to escape these attacks. So they have to find a way to push back on them. And the singular focus on healthcare, to the exclusion of virtually everything else, made it difficult for vulnerable congressional Democrats to make that pushback. As well, the House itself sort of being pretty low energy over the past year, I think contributed to this as well. There was no kind of messaging coming from the top, no kind of unified strategy coming from the top outside of this healthcare push that would have helped build more durable messages. Over the past couple of days, there's been this dispute about who's responsible, and Ocasio-Cortez has gotten a lot of blame. She gave this interview to the New York Times where she placed the blame on campaign strategies. And interestingly, and kind of missed in all of this, is that Doug Jones in Alabama, no one's idea of a left-winger, no one's idea of a bomb thrower, made the exact same criticism as AOC did about Democratic campaign strategy, about the lack of investment on the local level, but the lack of investment on a state level, about a strategy that relies too much on finding good candidates and not enough on actually trying to work and shape the districts as they exist. And I think that's right. And I think that the weakness of Democratic party building over the past decade, not just over the past 2 years, but over the past decade, has as much to do with this story as accusations of wanting to defund the police or bring socialism, which are accusations Democrats have been facing as long as I've been alive.
So I just want to push back a little bit on that. So it's not that anybody would.
We're at the pushback.
I knew John was going to jump in on that right away. Can I just say one thing really quickly, John? Because I know you're going to. So Jamel, I wasn't saying that Democrats were running on that. I said that Republicans allowed them to be defined by that.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that was the difference. The problem was that we all know that in campaigns, you don't want your opponent to define you because then you're on defense the whole time. And that's where, and I think we actually agree that because the Democrats, with the things that you just listed, that contributed to why they were not prepared for it. Because you're right, believe me, I've been on the other side. We've been accusing Democrats forever of being socialists and anti-law enforcement. That's not new. But what was new was the environment when you had the riots in Portland and the disturbances. It gave visual images to go along with that messaging that reinforced it. And Democrats didn't have a good answer. Go ahead, John.
Sure. So just. There's a lot of good that I agree with in what you're saying. The thing I disagree with is the problem is it wasn't just that the typical playbook of saying defund or socialism. Democratic elected leaders are saying we should defund the police. During so much of the movement, out loud, we should defund the police. Now, the thing is, there may be those who say defund doesn't mean defund, it means reallocation. Defund has meaning. Defund means take away the funds. And so the fact is, with that moment, with all the tragedy that happened, there was also a paralysis within the party because it was incredibly tragic, incredibly horrible, where a lot of Democrats honestly should have stepped up immediately and said, we hate what has happened. There are massive problems with our law enforcement system. That said, people have a right to defend their communities. So defund, if you look at the ads, like what happened in the Webb campaign, including he saying the word defund, which was caught on a Zoom, other Democratic elected leaders saying defund, that did become our de facto position, even though it isn't the de facto majority position of the party. We have Democratic elected leaders, one of which almost won our nomination, that say, I am a socialist. So these aren't things that are just made up by the Republicans. There are those within our party that are those things. So they think, one, we have to feel comfortable that, there are going to be people who call themselves socialists in our party. And that's okay. That's a good thing. But there are people who are going to be centrist, and that should be okay too. In terms of the healthcare part, Janelle, I completely agree. This overdependence on healthcare, this rerunning of the 2018 playbook. I think anytime when you have a campaign message, pre-existing conditions, which already, unless you unpack it and explain what it means for folks, when they shorthanded it to pre-ex into Washington speak, that's when you knew it was a losing message and it lost all meaning. And separate aside from the polling, when we're in a time of such health and economic anxiety, to cede the entire economic argument over to them, polling notwithstanding. And part of this is, if you think about the old Steve Jobs thing, is when people keep hearing pre-existing conditions, that's sort of top of mind because it keeps being on the TV, but it doesn't really get at the overall thoughts of what they're going through and experiencing things. So I completely agree with you, Jamel. There was a false positive, an over-reliance on healthcare. And for people like Max Rose, where you have to do anything but be a national Democrat, pre-existing conditions became the national Democratic argument. And when we picked up 40 seats in 2018 and 36 of those were Trump districts, you better not be sounding like a national Democrat. And that's what happened with pre-existing conditions. That became, I am a national Democrat, both in the positive and the negative. Last thing on the Trump stuff. The other thing, as much as I'm so happy Biden won and it was not a repudiation and the reckoning that we talked about that's going to happen. Then we realized this country, if they didn't implicitly endorse the hate, they condoned it by voting for that man. That is the big problem that makes me incredibly sad and frustrated. Even if you didn't love it, you liked it enough and let it happen. And that is incredibly sad for this country. But the thing that I thought that Biden, and he won, it's hard to criticize when he won, the fact that this sort of Biden in the basement bunker, low energy guy versus this strong man who's going around the country. And look, there's a safety thing with those rallies, but the fact that he was speaking with loud energy, and you look at how he masterfully turned getting COVID into being kind of this Superman. Meanwhile, we're talking to cars. So like the other part of it is we need to be able to capture the energy. I know there were health concerns about Biden himself. I know there were health concerns about living by example, but I think that also, if you look at places like South Florida, we seem weak. And there's a strong versus weak part that I think played into that.
Just to build off that, not pushing back now, just building off it a little bit. I think the economic point is really important. The one area where Trump had majority approval all year was the economy. And I don't think Democrats did enough work to try to push back on that. And one consequence of that is that the stimulus checks, the unemployment insurance supplementals, things that Democrats pushed for in negotiations that Republicans were publicly against in March, redounded to the Republican Party's benefit. And I think that has so much to do with how Democrats could not piece together a strong enough economic message. I kind of think this upcoming Georgia special can be a test of whether or not Democrats can put together an economic message. That the message from Ossoff and Warnock should be, if you want another round of stimulus checks, you have to deliver a Democratic Senate. That's sort of the thing that I think will make a dent. And it's not clear to me that Democrats quite realize that Republicans, on the basis of Democratic policies, have put up an advantage on the economy that they actually do need to challenge. They cannot simply leave to remain. Because there's this great Wall Street Journal story on Democratic gains and Republican gains rather in South Texas, and so much of it had to do with those checks. And I think Democrats
and you know what else?
need to reckon with that.
Jamel? You know what else, Jamel? It was I think it was CNN or maybe it was MSNBC had a great story on the Hispanic gains in South Texas and those border towns where those workers were in the oil and gas industry, and how the talk of getting rid of fracking and, all of that, it was an economic decision, and how these blue districts down there almost went red, majority Hispanic counties, strictly off of that, because they were worried about the economic well-being and safety net for their families and their jobs. And so that was another area that I think was a blind spot for Democrats on that. And we all know, those of us that have done campaigns, John, when you're explaining, you're losing. And so if you have to explain, no, I didn't really mean we're going to get rid of fracking, or no, we don't really mean we're going to defund police, even though some people said that, you're losing. You lose people. It's already set in their minds. So that was another aspect of the economic argument that I think we'll hear more about as far as explaining some of the Hispanic gains for Trump in areas where you would think that would not be the case, given the xenophobic nature of this entire administration up to this point.
One thing I did find so interesting is how split people were about coronavirus and COVID, because it really did. First, the mask versus no mask, kind of the Democratic nanny state tisking. When I would travel and go on different shoots, you'd go to Seattle and everybody's in a mask. And if you took the thing down off your nose for 3 seconds, people were just screaming and yelling and carrying on. Then you go to a place like Southeast Iowa, and it's like COVID had never happened, where you're running around, you're at a restaurant, people are eating each other's fries. I mean, it really did become a cultural touch point of, do you want to open up the economy back up? And do you believe in this? This is kind of a hoax. We're being too weak. Or I worry about the health of this country. What's interesting now is you look at like Governor Reynolds in Iowa, where basically she is in over her head. She is overwhelmed. There's a spike. There are hospitals. They have patients out in the hospital. A great friend of mine is a nurse there. They're talking about having people who are infected with COVID continue to work as nurses and doctors in hospitals. That is a lack of leadership, but that doesn't change the political debate about it. It really is such a torn up country, in addition to the presidency, COVID itself.
Well, here's, I'll direct this to Tara, and then if others want to chime in, please do. It's related to COVID. And that is, if you go back and look at the polls in like February and March, before Biden was actually the nominee, but was, being tested against Trump. I think on March 1st, Biden's national lead was something like 4 or 5 points in the polling averages, which actually ended up being more accurate than numbers the day before the election. It seems like it's going to be that way. And so, like, is it possible that COVID basically had no real impact on the outcome of this election? Or, I mean, or if you think it did have an impact, what impact do you think it had, Tara?
So one of the things I was surprised about was how little the COVID situation had. I think it had some impact. I think it's clear. I mean, that was an area that Biden led on the entire time. And I mean, how anyone could watch the daily briefings, and if you start to read some of the after action reporting coming out about different inflection points during the campaign, Politico just did a really good one of this. And everyone recognized that COVID was a serious problem and could possibly be the death, no pun intended, of Trump's reelection effort if he didn't take it seriously. And I think it ultimately did sink him, because people cannot get away from the fact that hospitals are, building field hospitals. People are dying. They're losing family members. I mean, 230,000 plus, I think we're up to 240,000, and millions of infections cannot be ignored. So that is something that you cannot tell people that didn't impact them. It directly impacted them. So I would be curious to see, I mean, we're still kind of in this phase where we're analyzing everything, what it ultimately, how much of it actually ultimately did influence voters, and that getting out of this, because the COVID and the economy are tied together. And if you want to say that there's any genius or any strategy to Trump's reelection effort, it was to define this as an economic issue early on. A freedom economic issue. Well, we have to open. Kids have to go back to school. They kept repeating this over and over and over again. The propaganda machine behind that was extraordinary. Versus, we can do this but this is a life-threatening pandemic. This is life-threatening. No one wants to shut down the everything and have people lose their jobs by the millions. Of course, we don't want to do that. But if we don't do it prudently, thousands and thousands of people will die, including possibly you or your kid's teacher or your family. I don't think that the Biden campaign had a strong enough message to combat Trump's, we've got to open, people have to go back to work, because that's what people focus on. That's literally their livelihoods. Yes. So no, I think COVID, because it was very real for a lot of people, and because it spiked so badly at the worst possible time for the campaign, that I think it did play a role. How big? Not sure. But given Trump's absolute dereliction of duty here, that it became, I've always said it was a cult of personality before, it literally became a death cult at that point, where people were so desensitized to the loss of life. That concerns me moving forward as a country societally, actually. But the fact that so many Americans were willing to cast that ineptitude aside, and that cruelty, the brazenness of that, is extraordinary. And I think that we're going to have to face that as a country moving forward.
One of the things that I found interesting is, typically when there are bad indicators, they're tied to the president, the economic indicators, the health indicators. Here, separate from that, Trump was able to be a president at war with his own government. So when there were bad stats, he would blame Fauci. He would badmouth the other people. On the economy, he would stick it to the Fed. And people were like, yes, there's Trump fighting for our values, and then there's a government screwing everything up. Now, it wasn't everybody, but it was enough people who love that kind of working class. I love that he's fighting for me and sticking it to the government. This government screwing it up. Luckily, we have Trump. So that's number one. But
not my fault. Not my fault, right?
Not my fault. It's those guys who are screwing it up. And then number two, I do agree with you, Tara, that here's the thing. I do think Biden without COVID would have lost. I think it's a shocking thing. And so I think we all thought this would be overwhelming indictment of his mishandling. I think it was just enough to have us win, but not the overwhelming thing and the disaster that we thought it would because of that. And I think honestly, the COVID approach, this Superman thing helped Trump. And then by the way, if the vaccine had been announced the Friday before the election, I think we also would have lost that too, quite frankly.
Good point.
I worry for it.
You know, Trump was talking about having that Superman shirt like under his suit back to the White House. Like he should have done it, I think, from a political standpoint. Because I think, you know, a lot of you've all mentioned this, that there is this sort of, you know, that Trump just has a lot of personality, and a lot of people like that personality and this sort of kind of brashness. And I think that actually would have illustrated it in some ways. Just want to get into sort of the last point here because we're running out of time, and thanks to all three of you for joining us today. But I want to direct this to Jamel, and then if John or Tara want to chime in, feel free. Jamel, you were talking earlier, sort of what I was just talking about now, about the kind of the personality of Trump, and that was sort of a successful political persona, I think, in both a narrow win and a narrow loss in presidential elections. You're a Republican looking at 2024 and looking at the presidential field, and I think Marco Rubio even sort of suggested that if Trump wanted to run again, he would be the favorite, and you could almost make the case that he might be the party's best option, just from a purely just from a rational kind of cold political standpoint. Do you think that that's the case?
So I think there's this unanswered question about Trump, which is the surge of low propensity non-college white voters that marked his 2016 electoral college win. And as a quick sidebar, it's strange that Biden at the end of the day may end up winning the popular vote by like 6 or 7 million, but we still consider this like a narrow victory because of the thin margins in a handful of states. I think that reflects kind of the problem with the voting system overall. But back to the main point, Trump is responsible in both cycles for this big surge of voters. It does not show up in 2018, didn't show up in the 2017 Virginia or Alabama elections, right? Anytime Trump has not been on the ballot for a big election over the past 4 years, the surge does not happen. But when he's on the ballot, it happens. And so does that reflect a structural change in American politics? So a formerly low propensity group of voters is becoming more like higher propensity. They're getting more into the habit of coming out. Or does it reflect a unique Trump effect that because of his celebrity, because of the fact that for 10 years he was kind of beamed into people's homes as the rich guy par excellence, and that he has this unbreakable brand in that regards? Is that the thing that is bringing those voters out? If it is the former, if it's a structural change, then I don't necessarily think Republicans need Trump again in 2024, right? I think they can run someone else and get some of that same kind of effect. But if it's a specifically Trump effect, then I do think it may turn out that he remains the best political bet, that he is the candidate who can bring out, much in the same way that Barack Obama was able to bring out low propensity African-American voters in this big way, Trump may be the guy. And also low propensity white voters, I think Trump may be the same kind of guy. And I think this may speak to something about the American electorate, which is that there is this large number of voters who aren't particularly ideological, who dislike politics, and who are attracted to figures who seem to embody both things. It seems to embody a dislike of traditional politics. We talked earlier about him running against his own White House and administration. I think that's just very much part of it. And who are drawn to either the hope represented by someone like Obama or the entertainment and fun represented by someone like Trump. And you take that off the ballot, and you do lose those voters. They're just not very motivated to turn out. And so I don't think I frankly do not think that there is any currently serving Republican politician who can replicate that element of Trump. There's no one.
I completely agree with Jamel. And
Me too.
the other part of it is Donald Trump has a stranglehold on this party. And as long as he's living, it will be his party. Look no further than Georgia. Loeffler and Perdue asking and calling on the Secretary of State to resign. They are scared out of their minds that basically a petulant Donald Trump will say, I'm sitting out the Georgia election. These are my people. They're not yours. Go suck it. I bet you if he said, Loeffler and Perdue, I want you to show your loyalty to me, go run naked through the streets up and down Atlanta, they would do it. They honestly, need these people. They need him. And they know it's his party and they're beholden to it. And the cowardice out of that party is absolutely incredible and shocking. And when he is finally gone and out of our lives, there are going to be a lot of people, hopefully, ashamed and writing mea culpas. It is absolutely embarrassing for them. I don't know why they serve if all they're going to do is kowtow to this and destroy our democracy. It is absolutely insane. But it's his party. It's Donald Trump's party as long as he wants it.
I agree 100% with both of you on that, which again, I will say is why I decided to walk away from it. Looking at this, it is a malignancy and it's not Republicanism. People can say that the Republican Party is now the party of Trump, but small c conservatism, the traditional Republican tenets of what made Republicans Republicans since Lincoln, that doesn't exist anymore. There is no more small government, fiscal responsibility, strong national defense, strong alliances, those things, character mattering. All of those things are out the window for this nationalist, populist, grievance mongering, cult of personality led party of obsequiousness that is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And I think to Jamel's point, it is about Donald Trump, which is why even if he loses, he's lost. But even, once, Biden takes office on January 20th, you still have his kids. There's a reason why Don Jr. and Eric and that whole clan and Javanka are out there establishing their brands because they think if for whatever reason, let's say Donald Trump can't run again in 2024. He's not young. He's not healthy. So who knows? I mean, he can continue to run things behind the curtain from his Twitter fingers, but the Trump brand will still be present. It's not going anywhere. And the idea, we already know that it has nothing to do with the Republican Party itself. This has to do with Trumpism. The reports about him basically saying to hell with the GOP, I don't really care about them. I'm looking at how he can monetize this into a business or making it a digital media empire, how we can leverage these fundraising, massive email lists and massive voter data into competing against Fox News possibly, tells you everything you need to know about what his priority is. This is him fulfilling his own malignant narcissism and sociopathy, not about the future of the Republican Party, which makes it so that much more infuriating that Republican Party leaders who know better, Mitch McConnell knows better, Marco Rubio knows better, these senators know better, and yet they are willing to make this craven political calculation for the expediency of now, for the power of now, completely ignoring the long-term damage that this is doing, not only to the party itself as being a viable, sane party, but just to the health of our constitutional republic by setting the precedent of what they will accept and what can be normalized here. It's absurd, and that's why there has to be pushback, continued pushback on this. And so if Donald Trump, it is the Trump effect. I don't think that you'll be able to recreate this type of enthusiasm with these low propensity voters that Trump has been able to unearth and bring out to the polls without a Trump-like figure. If it's not him himself, it would have maybe Don Jr. or Eric or whoever. I mean, these aren't exactly brain surgeons here, but they have their, I mean, let's be honest, but they have that same kind of brand, which is what they're trying to, they're trying to massage so that they can keep the grift going. The idea that Don Jr. or Kimberly Guilfoyle would run the RNC, possibly, that's being reported, or that a Corey Lewandowski type would run these operations, you're going to completely, it's not going to be a traditional political operation anymore. It will be a media propaganda machine to increase the Trump brand, not pushing Republican policies. They don't give a damn about Republican policies. They don't care about governing. It's clear. Look at how dysfunctional it's been for the last few years. What major policy wins have they actually had, other than regulations, which most people don't pay attention to, other than the tax cut? That was it. That was a big deal. I mean, I was glad to see a tax cut for businesses and things like that. There were things that could have been changed by it. If we had a traditional Republican, there would have been a lot more accomplishments here without the undermining of our republic in order to do it. But I think that your Barack Obama we have not had the Obama coalition recreated, right, since Barack Obama. He was a big part of what happened in 2008. Joe Biden, even though he's gotten more numbers and the amount of people that have increased in as far as voter participation, I think just came from the absolute focus on the election. It's just been a crazy time. There were a lot of strong feelings on both sides, but I don't necessarily know that it was the Obama coalition that was recreated. It was more anti-Trump than it was pro-Biden. So does that get created again? Does Trump recreate that again? Does the Republican Party recreate that again without Trump or Trump people? No, I don't think so, because this is a unique, very strange dynamic. Circling back to Jamel's original comments when we first started off, that the dynamics of this election and the electorate are very complicated and multifaceted, and we'll be studying them for a very, very long time.
With that, I want to thank our panelists for joining us today. I think if the conversation is any indication, I think that there's going to be a lot of thinking to do about Donald Trump, and also that even out of the White House, that he's going to remain a focus in American politics. He's going to want the attention, and a lot of people are going to be interested in talking about what he's up to. So with that, thank you so much. And thanks to all of our viewers for joining in, not just for today's 22nd Annual American Democracy Conference, but also for the video series we've done throughout the fall. We enjoyed it, and we hope to be bringing more of that to you soon. So thank you.